Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you again. I come in fear and trepidation again with part two of my reading of Mark's Gospel. And carrying on the way I did it last week, but the other way around. Two ways I'm reading Mark's Gospel. One, as if it was a novel or a thriller and taking note of the plot and what's happening. And the other way of reading it spiritually, perhaps, or as a disciple, very personally, as a follower of Jesus, and personally engaging with it. And this week, I'm going to take the plot way of reading it as if it's a thriller, the first way of doing it, and then the questions will pick up on both of those. I was just checking up on something recently, talking about Mark's gospel in comparison to all the other gospels. And it said, remember I said last week, imagine you'd met somebody at the library and they'd got this book and said, wow, I've got this amazing book. And I said, well, to me, that's Mark's gospel. You've got to read it. It's just amazing. This defines which shelf the gospels in the library might be on, perhaps a little bit more. And it suggested, while I was reading, that Matthew's Gospel and John's Gospel you would find in the religious section of the library. That would be quite clearly. I think maybe John's Gospel would be in the religious philosophy section. If you were reading Luke's Gospel, it would be in the popular history section, a bit like Digging Up Britain, the popular TV series. Well, it's popular to me because I like it. That's where Luke would be, popular history, easy read. But if you were reading Mark, it would be in the thrillers, because it's a page turner that just keeps going and something different happens on each page. So that's where I would put Mark. Definitely, I would agree with that. And so reading it today as if it was a thriller, and the bit of the plot going to concentrate on today is the middle bit in Mark's Gospel, where the opposition to Jesus builds and builds and builds and almost gets to boiling point, and trying to understand what it was that had caused all that opposition to Jesus, and why he's on his way to Jerusalem, which is where it's all going to go pear-shaped. So I wanted to quote a little bit today from a book that I don't have, actually, but it's a book that's called Hearing the Whole Story, The Politics of Plot in Mark's Gospel, and it's written by Richard Horsley. I spent a lovely time, some time away at Gladstone's Retreat House, I think it was, where I found this book in the library, and I was captivated by its particular way of reading Mark's Gospel. I've got a few quotes that I did write down from it. Here's one of them. He says that, speaking of Mark's Gospel as something that was, he calls it orally performed, as in spoken. The Mark as we've got it is a written document, but as we were saying last week, very much originally it was a spoken piece, almost a play text, something that lived because it was told, it was spoken. And Richard Horsley says, although Mark may not have a suspenseful plot, well, I think it probably does, like some modern novels, he says, it does exhibit a dramatically escalating conflict that builds to a climax in a sequence of steps. And it certainly does do that. He says, Mark's oral story is far more than just one thing after another. It's a dramatic story in which the dominant conflict between Jesus and the rulers, and the subordinate conflicts between Jesus and his disciples, and Jesus and the demons, develop and escalate from act to act until they come to a climax with the final events in Jerusalem. I would certainly agree with that reading. And so why this conflict, and what is going on as we read it? So to the gospel, and the key verse, one verse really, which is repeated and unpacked in this, is from Mark chapter 8 and verse 34. Mark's gospel, if you like, comes in three bits. The first bit is Jesus in Galilee, going around the villages, preaching, teaching, healing. The second bit is his journey south, as we looked at the map last week, towards Jerusalem. And the third part is in Jerusalem with his passion and death. So we're sort of in the middle. We're on that journey towards Jerusalem where the tension is mounting and mounting. And we have this very famous verse, Mark chapter 8, verse 34. Jesus called the people to him as well as his disciples, and he said to them, anyone who wants to be a follower of mine must renounce self. He must take up his cross and follow me. So Jesus, at this point in the story, is on a journey. He's walking, traveling with purpose, and is inviting all those who are already traveling with him to make that decision that if they're going to follow him ultimately to Jerusalem, it means them taking up their cross and following him. So that's part of the key part of this bit of the gospel. So what's going on, and why is he going with such purpose towards Jerusalem? Well, Jesus has got into conflict in three ways. It's his own fault. He's caused it. He's asked for it. It's happened. And now he's got these three battles on his hand, which is what's now the consequences of which are what's driving him on. So the first one, let's have a look. We're going to go back to Mark chapter 4 for this one. Mark chapter 4, verses 35. And I'm going to read all the way into chapter 5, verse 20. So this is from that first part where Jesus has been exercising his ministry in Galilee, doing his stuff. And this is one of the things that he does. So fairly early on, Mark chapter 4, from verse 35. That day in the evening, he said to them, let's cross over to the other side of the lake. So they left the crowd and took him with them in the boat in which he had been sitting, and some other boats went with him. A fierce squall blew up, and the waves broke over the boat until it was all but swamped. Now he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion, and they roused him and said, Teacher, we're sinking. Don't you care? He woke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Silence, be still. The wind dropped, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, Why are you such cowards? Have you no faith even now? They were awestruck and said to one another, Who can this be? Even the wind and the sea obey him. So they came to the country of the Gerasenes on the other side of the lake. As he stepped ashore, a man possessed by an unclean spirit came up to him from among the tombs where he had made his home. Nobody could control him any longer. Even chains were useless, for he had often been fettered and chained up, but had snapped his chains and broken the fetters. No one was strong enough to master him. Unceasingly, night and day, he would cry aloud among the tombs and on the hillsides and gash himself with stones. When he saw Jesus in the distance, he ran up and flung himself down before him, shouting at the top of his voice, What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, do not torment me. For Jesus was already saying to him, Come out of the man. Jesus asked him, What's your name? My name is Legion, he said. There are so many of us. And he implored Jesus not to send them out of the district. There was a large herd of pigs nearby, feeding on the hillside, and the spirits begged him, Send us among the pigs, let's go into them. He gave them leave, and the unclean spirits came out of the man and went into the pigs, and the herd of about 2,000 rushed over the edge into the lake and were drowned. The man in charge of them took to their heels and carried the news to the town and countryside, and the people came out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus and saw the madman who'd been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there clothed and in his right mind, they were afraid. When eyewitnesses told them what had happened to the madman and what had become of the pigs, they begged Jesus to leave the district. As he was getting into the boat, the man who'd been possessed begged to go with him. But Jesus wouldn't let him. Go back to your own people, he said. Go home and tell them what the Lord in his mercy has done for you. The man went off and made known throughout the Decapolis what Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. It's important always with the Gospels, most scriptures, but particularly the Gospels, when we're used to reading such little bits of stories, to put 2 or 3 or 4 of the stories together and see them in context, because they relate to each other. One story introduces some of the themes that the next story will explore, that the story after it then concludes going back to the first story, if you see what I mean. So here we've got Jesus's authority. At first notice, we've got Jesus's authority over nature. We've got his authority displayed over the wind and the waves, and he seems to be Darth Vader-like, able to control the weather. Then we get this story of a madman. The story says he was possessed by demons. Maybe we would read it and say he was certainly mentally ill. I don't think it matters which way you read it. The point is, here is a man who is driven crazy by forces that seem to possess him. And Jesus heals him. Those forces are directed into the pigs. The pigs jump over the cliff and drown in the water. And then everybody is amazed at what's happened. So why are they all amazed? Well, if we dig a little bit further into the image of the lake and the storm on the lake, I remember a amazing Bible study led by Kenneth Howcroft on this story, where he pointed out that to any Jewish reader, you would understand a body of water with a storm would take you right back to the beginning of Genesis. In the beginning, when God created the earth was formless and void, and the wind hovered over the surface of the water. And that image in Jewish thought is an image of chaos. God didn't create the world out of nothing. In that first creation story in Genesis, God starts with a chaotic body of water and wind and waves. And part of God's action as the creator, the first thing God does is to bring order and calm. So what you've got in this story is Jesus doing what God did. That would have really annoyed some people, because they'd have thought, hang on a minute, who does this man think he is? As it says in the story, it's not who is this man, he can control the weather. It's Ecky Thump, who is this man? He does what God does, create order out of primeval chaos. So there's part of a conflict. Jesus is starting to do the stuff that God is credited with doing. Then he has authority over the demons and the spiritual oppression of these demons. And when you read the gospel, there's lots and lots of stories of people possessed by demons or possessed by evil spirits, and Jesus heals them. And like with the lake, he brings order out of chaos. And that's what he did with this man. I love this story of the man who was possessed, finding peace. Long time ago, when I was in ministry in Cornwall, I got a phone call on Christmas Eve one day from a desperate family. I didn't know them, but the guy had just been put in an ambulance and sent off to hospital. He tried to hang himself in the outhouse on Christmas Eve, trying to take his own life. And off I went to visit the family and to see this guy in hospital. And as I got to know him, he was somebody, a young man with 4 children, a partner. I think 2 of the children were from his partner from a previous marriage, and 2 of the children were from him and her together. They got these 4 young children. He'd just been diagnosed with MS, and life was too much getting on top of him, and he tried to end his life. He was taken to hospital, and I went to visit him there and started chatting and getting to know him. And I visited him a few times over the subsequent months as he recovered. He began to talk about the MS and the effects on him, and get a little bit of treatment and sort himself out a little bit, and recovered, and it was great. But the more I talked with him, the more I used this story of a man who was mad and Jesus brought peace, because that's what struck me this guy's life experience was. Yeah, he moved on. The life settled down and the family got on with life. And then we went back to Cornwall on holiday some years later, and I just happened to bump into him in the supermarket car park, completely out of the blue. And there was this happy with it, in control of life guy. His MS was pretty much in remission, and he was doing well. He'd got teenagers holding hands with them as they walked across the car park. I said, "Oh, it's Gary, isn't it?" He said, "Yeah, it's Rob." So we had a quick catch up, you know how you do. And I thought, wow, there's the guy seated at peace and in his right mind, still getting on with a good life. And I talked to him. I don't know whether he went on to faith. I doubt it very much. But I talked to him about this sense of, look, God can bring that sense of peace into your life. And I think that was something that I recognized that had happened to him. So Jesus sends the demons out. The man finds peace as the chaotic lake had found calm, as the waters at creation had found peace. And then the pigs go and commit suicide by diving into the water. The pigs, again, obviously to a Jewish mind, are unclean. So what happens to them doesn't matter. We all go, well, what about the farmer losing all his stock? That's not part of the story, I'm afraid. And the pigs and the demons are sent into the lake, the place of chaos, which Jesus has already calmed. So his authority over the demons is to send them to the place of chaos, which he has already brought peace to. So Jesus's authority here is the authority of God, the creator, but it's also the authority of God over the demonic forces that upset this world. And that's why people were so amazed, because here in Jesus, this popular teacher and healer, they're seeing the qualities of God himself. John in his gospel was to say the word was made flesh. Here is Mark doing exactly the same thing. Here is God in human form doing what God does in our little lives in Galilee. So the first conflict Jesus causes is with the spiritual world, the devil and his demons, and the evil spirits. Jesus has power and authority over them, power and authority over the spiritual chaos of the natural world, and that starts to bring him into conflict with other demons. Well, like this one who already said, "Go away from us, Son of the Most High God," because the demons knew who he was, and they knew he was coming to sort them out. So the first of the three levels of chaos, of conflict Jesus has, is with the spiritual forces. Let's jump sideways a little bit before we go on to the next two forms of conflict, and go back into Galilee, where Jesus started his ministry. And we find out that the kind of people Jesus is ministering to are the little people, the peasants, the villagers, the ordinary down-to-earth folks who are under the thumb of oppression in two ways. They're under the thumb of oppression of the Jewish religious authorities, who tell them they've got to enter into all sorts of complicated Jewish rules and ways in order to satisfy the Jewish law. And they're also under the thumb of the Roman occupying power, who tell them there's all sorts of civic and civil ways they've got to behave because the Romans are in charge. And I'll just quote a little bit again from some notes I made from Horsley's book, where he outlines this particular dynamic that is in the gospel. And he talks about the narrator of Mark's gospel. Let's call him Mark. Probably wasn't a guy called Mark, but we'll call him Mark. He remains ubiquitously in the third person. It's always this happened, then that happened. He never enters into the dialogue himself. He's always the storyteller. And he uses all sorts of ambiguity, metaphor, irony, paradox, all sorts of ways of telling a story that present the story of Jesus. And Horsley says, was it a gospel originally? He says, not sure. It was a Greek-Roman device, a way of telling a story with anecdotes and miracles which deliberately illustrate the character or virtue of a hero. So he's going back to the type of literature that it was way back in the 1st century. He said the Greeks and Romans, when they produced this kind of literature, often spoke of kings and generals or prominent politicians. Whenever this form of literature was produced, the hero was always somebody big, somebody powerful, somebody that was the hero they were looked up to. What is subversive about Mark's gospel is that the hero is a peasant amongst peasants, in the best sense of the word peasant. He's a little guy, an ordinary guy from a village amongst the villagers, and he is described as the hero, and he is the one who is going to be the one who transforms the world by his presence in it. So we've got Jesus as the hero emerging in a village of people who were oppressed. Let's just go back for a minute into the Old Testament to get something possibly of Jesus's self-understanding. And I'm going back to Exodus chapter 12, because Horsley reckons this is key to understanding what Jesus is doing in Mark's gospel. Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 to 14. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be for you the first of the months. You are to make it the first month of the year. Say to the whole community of Israel, on the 10th day of this month, let each man procure a lamb or a kid for his family, one for each household. But if a household is too small for one lamb or kid, then taking into account the number of persons, the man and his nearest neighbour may take one between them. They are to share the cost according to the amount each person eats. Your animal, taken either from the sheep or the goats, must be without blemish, a yearling male. Have it in safekeeping until the 14th day of this month, and then all the assembled community of Israel must slaughter the victims between dusk and dark. They must take some of the blood and smear it on the 2 doorposts of the lintel of the houses in which they eat the victims. On that night they must eat the flesh, roasted on the fire. They must eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. You are not to eat any of it raw or even boiled in water, but roasted, head, shins, and entrails. You are not to leave any of it till morning. Anything left over until morning must be destroyed by fire. This is the way in which you are to eat it. Have your belt fastened, sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you must eat it in urgent haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On that night I shall pass through the land of Egypt and kill every firstborn, man and beast. Thus I shall execute judgment. I, the Lord, against all the gods of Egypt. As for you, the blood will be a sign on the houses in which you are. When I see the blood, I shall pass over you, and when I strike Egypt, the mortal blow will not touch you." The institution of the Passover, the beginning of the covenant that the Jews had with God, that God had with his people. And the suggestion, Horsley's suggestion, is that as the plot unfolds in Mark's gospel, we have Jesus deliberately, by his actions, maneuvering himself into being God who is renewing the covenant. Here we've got in Jesus God coming to his people again and saying, let's go back to what the covenant of the institution of the Passover is about, and let's set it right again. Go back to the default setting, factory setting, if you like, of what the Passover was intended to be. And that doing that requires conflict with those powers that have upset what the covenant was supposed to be. And here in this first one of Jesus's authority over the chaos and the spirituality and the demons, we see this first cost of Jesus, the conflict it causes. The second one is Jesus's authority over the Jews and the Jewish authorities. And let's go to chapter 7 and verses 1 to 23 of Mark in order to get this one. Mark 7, verses 1 to 23. A group of Pharisees with some scribes had come from Jerusalem, met him, and noticed that some of his disciples were eating their food with defiled hands. In other words, without washing them. For Pharisees and Jews in general never eat without washing their hands in obedience to ancient tradition. And on coming from the marketplace, they never eat without first washing. There were many other points on which they maintained traditional rules, for example, in the washing of cups and jugs and copper bowls. These Pharisees and scribes questioned Jesus. Why do your disciples not conform to the ancient tradition, but eat their food with defiled hands? He answered, how right Isaiah was when he prophesied about you hypocrites, with the words, this people pays me lip service, but their heart is far from me. They worship me in vain, for they teach as doctrines the commandments of men. You neglect the commandment of God in order to maintain the tradition of men. I won't keep reading for time, really, but it goes on in the same way. Jesus is caused conflict, and he faces head-on the conflict from the Jewish authorities who say, hang on a minute, you're supposed to be a Jewish teacher and you're not following the laws. And Jesus deliberately questions those laws and says, yeah, well, you've got it wrong. You invented this whole long list of rules that all these poor villagers in Galilee are expected to live by, and it just oppresses them. It gets in the way. It keeps them under the religious thumb, and they can't get on with life. God doesn't want that. That's not God's wish for his people. So we get Jesus in conflict with the Jewish authorities. And as you read the whole of the gospel as a novel, like I say, you see that as their Jewish leaders come down from Jerusalem, meet Jesus and question him. And then as you get closer to Jerusalem, the opposition gets more and more and more. And when you get into Jerusalem, that's where it comes to the head. So Jesus's whole argument, he causes it because he's coming with this message of who the true God is, the God of Israel, and he is personifying that God in showing them what's got to be the right way round. And we'll go then into chapter 13 of Mark's Gospel, where we get the famous story, the apocalyptic chapter, if you like, where Jesus actually goes to the temple. Now, remember the setting for this one. We said last week, Mark's Gospel probably emerged in the 50s or early 60s of the first century, and it certainly by 70 AD, the Romans had destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and they had really offended the Jews because they'd put up an image of one of their deities right in the temple. It's like taking an image of Donald Trump and setting him up in your nearest Methodist church and saying, bow down and worship the Lord. And that really upset people in the year 70. And so this chapter is probably written as that situation historically is brewing, or it may be even later, and it may be just after it's happened. But that's the context of what was happening when the people were telling this story about Jesus. From Mark 13. As he was leaving the temple, one of his disciples exclaimed, look, teacher, what huge stones, what fine buildings. Jesus said to him, you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another. They'll all be thrown down. As he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, he was questioned privately by Peter, James, John, and Andrew. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen? What will be the sign that these things are about to be fulfilled?" Jesus began, "Be on your guard. Let no one mislead you. Many will come claiming my name and saying, 'I am he,' and many will be misled by them. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, don't be alarmed. Such things are bound to happen, but the end is still to come. For nation will go to war against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be earthquakes in many places. There'll be famines. These are the birth pangs of the new age. As for you, be on your guard. You will be handed over to the courts. You'll be beaten in the synagogues. You'll be summoned to appear before governors and kings on my account to testify in their presence. But before the end, the gospel must be proclaimed to all nations. So when you're arrested and put on trial, do not worry beforehand about what you'll say. But when the time comes, say whatever is given to you, for it is not you who will be speaking, but the Holy Spirit." And then jumping on to verse 14, "When you see the abomination of desolation usurping a place which is not his," let the reader understand, "then those who are in Judea must take to the hills. If anyone's on the roof, he must go down into the house and fetch anything out. If anyone's in the field, he mustn't turn back for his coat. Alas for women with child in those days, and for those who have children at the breast. Pray that it may not come in winter, for those days will bring distress such as there has never been before." And so it goes on and on and on with all this apocalyptic stuff about the end times. Maybe that's what it felt like when Mark's gospel first was performed, if you like, or told, because that was the experience people were living through. The point is, you've got Jesus in conflict with the Roman authorities who ultimately overthrew the temple, the Jewish authorities. And of course, it was the Romans who crucified Jesus. It was the Jews who didn't like what he was saying, offended by the fact that he seemed to be taking the place of God, handed him over to the Romans, and the Romans eventually crucified him. So we have Jesus on this journey, having said, if you want to follow me, you must take up your cross, in conflict with the spiritual powers, in conflict with the Jewish authorities, and in conflict with the Roman authorities. You couldn't get much worse, really. You couldn't cause much more trouble than Jesus did. And then a few verses now, I'm going to jump to Mark chapter 14 and just read 3 verses from there. Mark chapter 14 from verse 22. "During supper, Jesus took bread, and having said the blessing, he broke it and gave it to them with the words, 'Take this, this is my body.' Then he took a cup, and having offered thanks to God, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said to them, 'This is my blood, the blood of the covenant.'" And Richard Horsley suggests that here is Jesus at the Last Supper, celebrating the Passover, saying, all this conflict that has got us to this place, our remembering of our Jewish covenant, here I am renewing it for you, redefining it, and taking you, the poor, oppressed people of Galilee, and anybody else who feels that oppression. I've fought the powers that oppress you. Now here I am re-establishing the covenant. And in Mark's gospel, we get a couple more words that don't appear in any of the other gospels. Jesus said, "This is my blood, the blood of the covenant, shed for many," or in some translations, "shed for you and for many." And those words get missed out in all the other gospels. The theory is that Jesus is saying, actually, this is open now, this covenant with God. It's not a Jewish thing. It's open to you and to anybody and everybody who's invited in. 3 tiny little words that completely change the understanding of what's going on as Jesus goes towards his death, but is redefining this sense of what it means to set right the covenant with God, face the authorities, face the conflicts, and stand up for the poor people. He's a right little socialist, is Jesus, you could say, in the way he's representing those poorest people against the powers that oppress them, and going right back to the heart of what he understands the Jewish faith to be in order to renew it. So there's what's going on in the plot of the thriller. That's taken most of our time this morning. So just a few minutes, I've run out of time a bit today, just a few minutes on reading the same story as a disciple, as a Christian. And I think I just want to refer back to a book that some of you may remember, published in 1987. Gosh, that was a long time ago. The Meaning of the Warmed Heart by Donald English. A little Bible study book that I used a lot many years ago in small groups as people talking about their faith. But the reason I quote it is because Donald English talks right at the very beginning of how we come into discipleship. And he said, becoming a Christian disciple is not about going through a door into a tunnel, mutually exclusive of all other doors and all other tunnels. It says becoming a Christian disciple is rather to go through a gate into an arena. There are other gates, many other ways into the arena, and many people who are journeying round the arena, think of an ice skating rink, have entered a long time ago. Some of them are experts. Some of them, like you, are come in and are clinging onto the sides because you're just making it up from the first time. And I think that's a really, really fascinating way of coming to Mark's gospel as a disciple, as a Christian yourself, and saying, I'm only just coming in to meet Jesus and start this journey of following him. So what does it mean to take up my cross and follow him into this journey? If you've ever been ice skating, I gave up ice skating because I did my ankle in and I didn't see why I should put myself through that anymore. But it's a good image. There are people in the arena who are absolute experts. It's a joy to watch the way they can ice skate. And there are others who are encouraging children on the way. And it's not so much how they master the skating, it's the way they hold the children and keep other vulnerable people with them as they journey around the arena. And then there's us who cling on, or me certainly, clinging onto the side, just about trying first and faltering steps. But we're all disciples together in the way of Jesus, learning it and encouraging each other as we go along. So we have Jesus in chapter 8, verse 34, saying, take up your cross and follow me. And that gets repeated twice more to the disciple, as you certainly get the clarity from Jesus about what it means. Chapter 9, verse 30, Jesus says, it says, they left that district and made their way through Galilee. Jesus didn't want anyone to know because he was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is now to be handed over to the power of men, and they will kill him. And 3 days later, after being killed, he will rise again. But they didn't understand what he meant, and they were afraid to ask. And then again in chapter 10, verse 32, we get, they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was leading the way, and the disciples were filled with awe, while those who followed behind were afraid. Once again, he took the 12 aside and began to tell them what was going to happen. We're now going up to Jerusalem, he said. The Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes. They will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles. He'll be mocked and spat upon, flogged and killed, and 3 days afterwards he will rise again. And then we get those words in chapter 13 that we've already read. I'll just remind you of them, where Jesus says, verses 9 and 10, as for you, you will be handed over to the courts, you will be beaten in synagogues, you will be summoned to appear before governors and kings on my account to testify in their presence. So Jesus is making it quite clear, or the storyteller is making it quite clear, the purpose of this conflict is Jesus taking up his cross and suffering death and then rising again. And it's quite clear in the context of those early Christian communities that those early Christians also knew that experience. That was the cost for them of following Jesus, getting into conflict with the authorities and having to stand up for their faith and defend themselves. So what does that mean for our discipleship today? What does it mean to take up your cross and follow Jesus? I think that is pretty much a key question. And to finish, I think I am talking to people who will have heard the phrase before, atonement theories. The atonement theories are different ways of understanding what happened when Jesus died. There's the very famous, and it remains quite popular, one, a theory of what's happened is called penal substitution. God requires sin to be punished. Jesus goes to the cross, and in an odd sort of within the family way, Jesus allows his Father to punish him and rain all the wrath of God against the sin of the world onto Jesus, and that's what kills him, and Jesus absorbs it all. He is the substitute for what we all deserve, and therefore our sins are forgiven because God's got his wrath out of his system by killing his own Son. The way I describe it tells you I'm not a fan of that understanding. It remains popular in some circles today, but I don't hold much sway with that way of understanding. There's another way of understanding it. This is C.S. Lewis's favorite way, which is called the perfect penitent atonement theory, which says, if God wants to forgive us, why doesn't he just do it? Well, for forgiveness to work, we have to show real repentance. Because sin has affected all of us, by Jesus' death, he acts out what perfect penitence looks like, representing to God the way we all have to go, of being so sorry for our sins that we accept God's punishment, or Jesus accepts it, and therefore when we accept Jesus, we accept the forgiveness that God has always had on offer. Nice one, C.S. Lewis, but I'm not convinced. I want to finish with the atonement theory that is called moral influence in this version. And I'm taking these from an excellent little summary from a book by Brian McLaren, published over 20 years ago now, The Story We Find Ourselves In, Further Adventures of a New Kind of Christian. There was 3 books about a new kind of Christian Brian McLaren published, and in that one he helpfully outlines 7 of the main atonement theories. But the one that I think is being communicated to disciples in Mark's gospel is this: that when Jesus goes to the cross and accepts his death, it is an ultimate act of self-giving. He has completely abandoned himself to the consequences of standing up for what he believes in, which is the renewal of God's covenant, which is what the Passover is about. His death is an expression of what his whole life has been. And for him, it meant standing up to the authorities, getting into conflict with them, accepting the consequences of what they were going to throw at him in order to communicate his message, in order to win us over, in order to get us to hear and understand and accept what the kingdom of God is about, what God's will and God's way is. And the price of him ultimately doing that is to accept the death that's meted out upon him by those powers and authorities, the spiritual powers, the Jewish authorities, and the Roman powers. So my understanding is that Jesus goes to the cross ultimately in Jerusalem in order to say to us, look, will you follow me? This is what I believe in. This is what I stand for. Which brings us back to the question that I will now finish with. What does it mean to us to take up our cross and follow him today?